Hi there, I'm Dr. Joseph Lamb, and I'm coming to you from the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Center by Metagenics in Gig Harbor, Washington. And this is part of our Lunch and Learn series. You know, we've been doing these on Thursdays, the third Thursday of the month, and this is the third one of our series. And today we're going to be talking about aging gracefully. Wow, I cannot type as I have an aging gracefully with 3 L's scrolling across the bottom of the screen. My apologies. There, we've got it right. So that's what we want to try to do. We want to try to get aging right. You know, it's not necessarily an easy thing, and it's not necessarily something that we talk about a lot. You know, there's a lot of discussion about not wanting to get old. We talk about our birthdays, and we talk about the fact that we don't want to hit 40 or 50 or 60 or maybe even 30 we didn't want to hit. And we are redefining, you know, 60 is the new 50 and 70 is the new whatever. You know, we talk about these numbers because we don't want to get there. We don't want to get old. And indeed, the definition of aging is the process of growing old. It's the external signs of aging. And I think that that's what's got us so kind of freaked out as a society, that we associate aging, unfortunately, to be accompanied by illness and disease and not getting to do what we want to do. We associate it with not being as attractive, perhaps, as we once were, or not as athletic as we once were, or not able to participate in life like we once did. But that isn't necessarily what needs to take place. You know, it's kind of an interesting piece when you think about it. There is an inevitability about aging. We are indeed going to be moving through this process, and we are going to gain those years. There's no help for it but the fact that we're going to gain calendar years. But perhaps what we can think about is doing it a little bit differently. You know, James Fries, in a classic article in the New England Journal of Medicine way back in the early 1980s, talked about survival, and talked about the medical terms are morbidity and mortality. Morbidity means the presence of disease or the consequence of physical symptoms and loss of function that accompanies a disease. And mortality, obviously, is the death that takes place, you know, where we have the cessation of being a human being. We end our lives and we move on to whatever is in store for us next. But, you know, it is the ultimate catastrophe from a morbidity point of view. It is the complete loss of function. It is achieving a stability, which is a stability only because it's a null state, really. And, you know, so Fries talked about this kind of progression over time. And he talked about, you know, the fact that in some regards, starting at, you know, even maybe you could say age 18, at kind of the end of the standard puberty, we've achieved our kind of adult bodies. We've, you know, finished building, you know, particularly in the concept that was held in the 1980s, you know, we finished building our brains. You know, to a certain extent, we've gotten our adult muscles and bones, and there's a slow, gradual decline that takes place. And, you know, through those first couple of years, you don't really notice it. You know, like, and indeed, in some regards, we don't lose things very quickly. Like, you know, if we exercise less in college than we did in med school, than we did in high school, and less in med school than I did when I was in college. There's a loss of some muscle mass. Maybe I don't stand up as straight, but I still have strength. I still have a degree of flexibility. I still have a degree of balance. And those things slowly wear away over time. But I'm still left, for most of us, even if we weren't working out, even if we weren't doing those things, we're still left with enough balance and stability and flexibility and muscle strength to walk down the street, to walk into our jobs, to come home at night, to walk into a restaurant. We can do all those things. So there is a reserve still there to do the basic things. Similarly, if we breathe in the air in our environment, if we live in a polluted city and we're exposed to a lot of pollution, there's a slow, gradual decline. But because we have this concept of organ reserve and this concept that we have enough to last us through a certain amount of deterioration, we maybe don't get short of breath until we're in our 60s or 70s. The kind of combination of environmental insults, maybe we've been a smoker, which has hastened the process. And that's an important point. Lifestyle makes changes that can lead to a more rapid decline. But, for all of us, there's this gradual, here we are, at 18, and there's this gradual decline, and it steepens the time we get to middle age, and then all the way down, we lose organ reserve, we lose functional capacity, we get to do less and less. And Fries's point was that what you'd like to be able to do is take it and go this way. I'm now drawing it backwards. My apologies for that. I'm getting confused looking at myself in the mirror. But what you want to do is you want to take it from here at age 18 and have it very, very slowly go down until the last little part of our lifespan, have it be a steep compromise. It would be perfect to live to 80 years old, able to do everything that you could do when you were 20, go to sleep at night, and then just not wake up the next morning. That would be the perfect example of rectangularizing the morbidity curve, maintaining organ reserve and maintaining daily function right up until the very end, until the system wears out. It's like breakdown at the end. Now, Fries postulated that could be related to lifestyle. And when he did that in 1980, everyone basically laughed at him. And it was not recognized that that was something that could indeed take place. And fortunately, one of the scientists in his group working in his lab, named Vida, went on to actually do that study, and they followed people prospectively over time, meaning they collected data starting at that point and going forward. So they didn't just look back at old records, they collected data on a year-to-year basis, and they showed that lifestyle leads to moving that curve out. It leads to, it leads to, instead of this kind of gradual decline, that with a healthy lifestyle, you could make it more of a rectangle. And that would be the example of aging gracefully. So what's the definition of graceful? Well, quick Google search said that graceful means in an attractively elegant way, in a respectful and dignified way. And so when you apply that to aging, it's talking about recognizing that I'm not going to be the same person at 60 that I was at 30, or 90 that I was at 60, but trying to aim for having functionality throughout my life that's preserved and allows me to do the things that I want to do and allows me to show up in a really beneficial way. Dan Buettner talked a lot about this in his book, The Blue Zones. And what he called the blue zones were areas in the country where people lived, areas in the country and in the world where people outlive kind of the normal life expectancy, whether it's areas in Sardinia, whether it's areas in like Okinawa, for example, or Loma Linda, California, where there's a large proportion of Seventh-day Adventists. It's people living existences that prove out Freeze and Vida's concepts that you can make a difference in your life. Now, the thing that's really interesting about all of these components, and the thing that's interesting about this concept that we can live longer, is that it's not that there wasn't like one secret bullet. It wasn't just there was one set of dietary measures that made a difference. It wasn't just that there was like exercise was the answer. It was kind of a combination of lifestyle factors, getting good sleep. It was getting, exercise. But a lot of it was the way we thought, and also the way we showed up in community, the way we related with other people. And all of these pieces, like eating well, exercising, having a mind, body, spirit kind of relaxation process, a set of beliefs that give you grounding in the world, having a community that's supportive, who you can talk to. I read a recent blurb that said the majority of Americans don't feel like they have someone who they're close enough with that they can share a major problem with. That's a real hamper on our health. And the concept is that when all of these pieces come together, that is what health is. It's associated with longevity. It's associated with living into your 80s and your 90s. But, what do we mean by health? That's an interesting one when we talk about it. Is health the simple not having a disease? Because in a lot of ways, that's what people say. Well, I don't have high blood pressure. I don't have diabetes. I, haven't had a stroke, don't have lung disease, don't have heart disease, so don't have cancer. So I'm in a good place, right? I'm a good, healthy person. Well, health should be more than the simple absence of disease. I gave, we have a series on cardiovascular health, and I was talking about that this morning, that you don't just wake up with heart disease one day. It's not like you go from being perfectly fine yesterday and not having heart disease to having heart attack and sudden death this morning as you work, face your work day in the office. There was a slow progression. And so health should be more than that. And we should start thinking about health as more than that. And that's part of what's so important about aging gracefully, is how do we make those assessments? Because if health is more than the simple absence of disease, we shouldn't be measuring it by disease criteria. We shouldn't be measuring it by saying, I'm healthy because I don't have a disease. We shouldn't be measuring it by saying, I don't have high cholesterol, which is a risk factor for heart disease. Or we shouldn't be saying it by, I don't have a high blood sugar, or I don't have lots of autoimmune markers, which are beginning to go the wrong direction. those are telling us about disease risks, but they're not telling us about health. And so the question, and this is one of the questions that we're trying to resolve in our big study that we're doing here, sponsored by Metagenics, called Lifehouse, we're trying to explore markers of function that lead us to being able to describe health. You know, function, whether it's at a metabolic kind of microscopic level, or whether it's at a physical level in terms of my capacity to go for a walk or to step up and on and off a box, or whether it's my cognitive ability, you know, how, you know, what my IQ is, what my memory score is, whether it's my emotional function, you know, am I happy, am I sad, do I persistently stay depressed, or, you know, what's going on with my emotions, you know, am I fearful, am I anxious, am I calm, you know, all of those components. And you can take each of those parts and look at them and start identifying which factors are best to describe health. And there's actually a fifth one, which is the whole behavioral piece. What behaviors are you exhibiting in your life? Because if you think about it, you know, the kind of definition of a sacrament has always been the outward expression of an inward grace. Well, you can think about behavior as the outward expression of an inward balance. Because if things are working well inside, you know, if you have good metabolic function, you've got good blood sugar control, you don't have too much oxidative stress, you've got good circulation, you've got good transport, you know, you've got physical ability, so like you're able to walk, you're able to hike, you're able to run, you're able to lift weights, you know, you're bright, you're sharp, you know, emotionally you're in a stable place, you're, you know, optimistic. You could go and put all of those features together and be an ultra athlete. And that would be a sign of a true balance. If on the other hand, you know, you were, you know, had early diabetes, high blood sugar, bad cholesterol numbers, markers of autoimmunity, markers of inflammation, markers of oxidative stress, if you didn't have the functional capacity to walk even 100 yards, if you couldn't remember your name and where you lived, and if you suffered from mood swings and, you know, were depressed and sad and angry, you know, your outward behavior is not going to be capable of being an ultra athlete. Your outward behavior, that expression of that inward balance, is going to be pretty limited. You're going to be the person, you know, stuck in an independent, well, sorry, not independent, but either assisted living or the nursing unit or a memory care unit as you show those deteriorations. So ultimately, you know, that inward, all that function that's within us is expressed outward. And, you know, when you think about it, and, you know, there's the old kind of alchemist approach of as above, so below. Well, we could think about it, taking that as so without as within. So, you know, we live in interesting times, and aging has not always been the same process. So when we think about what's outside, as we think about an environment that's going through stress and changes, we could start thinking about our bodies going through that same sort of change within, you know, a kind of a holographic representation, you know, what's happening to the planet environmentally, what's happening to the planet sociologically, what's happening to the planet ecologically and economically, and, you know, the the COVID pandemic that we're experiencing at the moment, and the hustle and bustle of daily lives, that's the kind of, to go back to Lovelace's expression, that's the planet as an organism, Gaia, this kind of shared community of energy. And we look at it, and that hustle and bustle is reflected within our bodies and the changes and stresses that our bodies have as at the organism level, and then downward to a cellular level. And, just like Gaia and the earth would be many different creatures living here in an environment, our bodies, we've come to recognize, are the same, right? Because we have the microbiome, all of those bacteria and viruses and little worms and little parasites and yeasts that we live with. Indeed, in the average human body, there's 70 to 100 trillion living cells, of which 10 to 15 trillion are human. And the remainder are all those things that we live with. Now, that balance is a little distorted by size, because a human cell is much bigger than, a bacteria, for example. But still, if you took away everything that was human, we'd be casting a shadow. Everything else, the bacteria, the parasites, the little worms, the yeasts, the little mites, for example, that live on, our eyelashes and in our tear ducts, for some of us, that you can't see, they're microscopic. Those little organisms, all of those would cast a shadow. So we've got Gaia as a constellation of organisms living together. We've got ourselves as human beings. And, you can even take this down to a cellular level, because our cells are, have been invaded over time by bacteria and by viruses. The contribution of viral DNA to our own DNA plays a big role. We reflect the DNA that came from the past. If you do a 23andMe, they'll tell you how much of a Neanderthal you are. And even on an organelle level within a cell, we've got this grouping, because, it's thought that mitochondria may have represented a form of bacteria that was able to generate energy on itself. And when these bacteria invaded other cells, they provided an energy source. And so here we are, we're a combination at all these different levels. It's a holographic representation of what's taking place. And, indeed, I heard Jeff Bland once make the correlate that, if you think about the rising cancer rates that we're all experiencing, many cancers have been going up rather dramatically during the century. And if you think about cancers as being cells with unrestricted growth and kind of disorganization and failure to respect boundaries and using up too many resources, in some ways, that's almost a metaphor for our whole experience as humans, taking a role in Gaia that's damaging to everything else that's there. So, we have this holographic representation of what's taking place within us, and it's really results in the recognition that we aren't doing this aging process very well. For a number of years, we talked about a diagnosis of senile dementia. When I was in med school, yes, Alzheimer's was a diagnosis, but it was a specific category of dementia. And we kind of believed that Alzheimer's represented pre-senile dementia. And if you were old and you were demented, that was a natural consequence of what was going to take place. But the work of many, including like Franceschi, who was one of the first to coin the word inflammaging, points out, for example, that, we are it's not predestined that we are going to have that slow, gradual decline, that it's a consequence of inflammation leading to deterioration of function, and that there's something to do about it. Now, the interesting piece is to say, why are we suddenly in this, circumstance that we've all kind of fallen into? How did we get here? What seems to be taking place? Was there always planned obsolescence in a human being? Is it natural that systems wear out? And, menopause could be looked at as an interesting kind of one of these cycles of life's patterns, one of the rhythms that takes place. And if you think about it, our hunter-gatherer ancestors did not live as long as we do. Even our early agricultural ancestors clearly didn't live as long as we do. You look at societies and you look back, and average life expectancies were in the 20s and the 30s. And now, admittedly, that was because there was a lot of infant mortality and a lot of death in childbirth and a lot of people dying from trauma early on, and very few people aged. But you could make an argument that for most women of 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 years ago, they would never have become postmenopausal because there would have been enough organ capacity, enough reserve in terms of the eggs within an ovary, that process would have lasted them from the time they had onset, what's called menarche, the onset of menses, sometime during the teen years, and there would have been enough eggs to last them right through the end of their life, and they would have had the normal cycling each month of their estrogen and progesterone and the maintenance of fertility. So it's not so much that we have planned obsolescence in terms of hormone levels change. It may be that what's different is that we have very quickly increased the average life expectancy without trying to figure out what it means in terms of the genes we have and what it means in terms of the influence on those genes. Dr. Matt Tripp, who was the VP of R&D for Metagenics, used to talk about the fact that the largest nutritional experiment that's ever been done has been ongoing for the last nearly 70 years now, and it's been the westernization of the American diet. The development of frozen foods, the development of processed foods, the development of all these food chemicals and all the new food chemistry that leads us to have the ease and convenience that we do have, the use of the microwave, and all of these have led to an experiment and changes in our diet. It's fascinating, for example, if you go back to the 1860s, 1870s, the average American had somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 pounds of sugar a year. So they had less than a pound a month. They had less than half an ounce a day, if you think about it from that perspective. And now we're at a point where the average American, particularly if you toss in high fructose corn syrup and kind of call it the equivalent of sugar, which it certainly is in terms of its negative impacts when you get to high dosing levels, we're getting about 180 pounds, 18 times more in 140 years that have taken place. It's like, a significant change. And, 180 pounds of sugar in a year is 15 pounds of sugar a month. So instead of a half an ounce every day, we're now at the point where we're having about half a pound of sugar each day. Did I do that right? 15 pounds in a year. No, I'm sorry, 15 pounds in a year. Wait a minute. If it was a pound a month, that was a half an ounce a day. If it's 15 pounds in a month, then that's like 225 ounces. So that's, yeah, in the neighborhood of 7 ounces a day of sugar. You know, look at that increase in terms of the change that's taken place. And as we've done this, and as we've done other pieces, you know, like the introduction of trans fats to our foods, and why were they so popular? Well, trans fats were initially the creation of the Nazi scientists pre-World War II, when they were developing foods to replace what was missing. So the Germans were struggling because of their economy and because of their war effort. They were struggling with not having enough butter. So they wanted to take fats, you know, naturally occurring vegetable oils, and turn them into something margarine that looks like butter. But at room temperature, if you have a bottle of olive oil or if you have a bottle of corn oil, it's certainly not a solid. So they chemically modified it. They changed the structure from a cis fat to a trans fat. And these trans fats were effective because it allowed them to have something that looked like butter. It was margarine, tasted kind of the same. It was also very attractive because when you included them in baked goods, they extended the shelf life. And why did they extend the shelf life? Because bacteria and yeasts knew enough not to try to metabolize trans fats. And so they inhibited growth compared to the regular fats, and they didn't go rancid as quickly. So, you know, it preserved the quality of the food, but it had negative consequences. It made our cell membranes worse. It introduced an element of inflammation that was present. And then, you know, the environmental toxicity. You know, if you look at the environmental working group and look at some of their data, you know, the fact that when children are born, in their cord blood on the child's side of the cord, the fact that compounds, even like Teflon, are present at the present, and, you know, flame retardant chemicals and all sorts of persistent organic pollutants and pesticides and plastics. You know, the fact that a child is born with a toxic burden is just incredible to think about. And this has these changes, you know, and the presence of, you know, electromechanical radiation, electricity generating fields, light sources that impact us. You know, all of this, you know, plays a role in an influence upon our bodies, which may be indeed problematic. And so as we look at this, and as we look at other kind of cyclical changes in our lives, you know, many of us persist in thinking about aging as being something that starts late in life. But if you think about it, one of the first aging type cycles we undergo is puberty. You know, and what has happened to the age of menarche, at the age at which little girls have their first periods? It has gotten earlier and earlier and earlier over the last decades. You know, in the 1930s and the 1940s, the average little girl was 13 to 14 years old before they had periods. And now that age has dropped to 11 to 12, and there's actually little girls 8 and 9 years old who are getting pregnant, which obviously means that we have huge problems with abuse that need to be addressed, but it also means that that child has had a physiology that's been distorted enough that they've already had their menarche. And, little boys, on the other hand, are having delayed puberty. And what is causing this? Well, part of it is changes in body composition in terms of getting excess fat, which impacts the metabolism of testosterone into estrogens, the aromatization of testosterone, which produces estradiol. So little girls are getting higher estrogen levels earlier, but it's also the compounds that are present in terms of estrogen-like compounds like persistent organic pollutants, which include pesticides and plastics, and that these have effects. The herbicide atrazine has been demonstrated, for example, in studies to impact amphibians and reptiles and birds and fish in terms of their sexual development and in terms of their sexual behaviors. Classic studies have been done in African clawed frogs, which demonstrate that behavior has changed related to the fact that there's been a change in testosterone levels in these frogs that have been exposed to environmentally relevant levels, meaning levels that are there in the groundwater. It wasn't like I did an experiment and took, a frog egg or a frog embryo or a little tadpole, along its development and grew it in a bath that was essentially all atrazine. No, these are levels that could be measured in the drainage ditch near a field or in the water runoff in the pond down the way, and what the impact is when you measure this. And, you think about this, and, like we talked about this, my friends and I, when we were fishing at my friend Harold's farm in North Carolina, like we're fishing in this pond right here in the middle of farm country, and there's a field there and there's a field there. And this pond has groundwater coming from there. Am I going to eat the fish out of this pond? Probably not. But the concept being that, early changes are being influenced. Our aging changes at a very fundamentally early age. The falling sperm counts, which may be related to persistent organic pollutants and to xenoestrogens and the such like, and falling testosterone levels. Do we call that a sign of aging? Do we call that a sign of toxicity? You maybe would think about it as a urologic process, but when you consider that studies suggest going from the 1930s to the 1990s that there was a 50% reduction in sperm counts, and now some people would say, oh, the methodology of measuring those sperm counts has changed, so you can't compare them. It's apples to oranges. But really, when you look at the technique, it's a little bit more like comparing a Macintosh to a Red Delicious. Similar type counts, some changes in the methodology, but the numbers are going down. At the moment, because of, organ reserve in terms of how much sperm the average male makes and how much is needed to have fertilization, there's redundancy and capacity, but it has become personal tragedy for some families in terms of their fertility. But what's going to happen when it becomes a societal tragedy? That sort of aging. When you think about the toxicity from the environment of these same estrogenic compounds, the xenoestrogens, the pesticides, and the plastics, and the tumors that are influenced by them, like breast cancer or ovarian cancer, or even prostate cancers in men, we've got aging changes that take place across the whole spectrum of human life, and a lot of these can be addressed from a holistic model. And indeed, that's kind of the benefit of the functional medicine model, right? Functional meaning looking at function, comparing it to dysfunction, looking at that matrix, looking at things like digestion and absorption and energy production and metabolic transformation and, circulation and transport and all of the various components that take place within us. And by looking at function when it's less than optimal, before it's necessarily related in behavioral changes, it allows us to move the lever and do something. If I try to lift up 500 pounds, I'm not going to be very successful. If I can get a pole under one end of that, and I can put some sort of fulcrum in place, then I've got an opportunity to move it or budge it, and I can change the trajectory down the way. Part of dealing with some of these changes that we see associated with aging is recognizing the consequences and seeing it early. Just like I said, we don't wake up one day with heart disease just because that's the first day we have symptoms. We don't wake up just one day with diabetes because that's the first day someone's made a diagnosis and said that our fasting blood sugar is greater than 125. There's been a slow, steady progression. Oxidative stress on the mitochondria of the beta cell leading to high insulin levels, kind of Barbara Corky's work where things like even iron or, some of the artificial sweeteners or some of the fats that are present in our food lead to that stress and we get higher insulin levels. The excess of carbohydrates, the excesses of fats that lead to the higher insulin levels, that slow, steady progression of disordered physiology followed by postprandial blood sugar elevations, followed by eventually fasting blood sugar elevations, it represents a slow, steady progression, and it depends where you look. For years, we've said that being overweight causes diabetes, and yet we've recognized that this really isn't the case. Obesity is one of the first signs of the disordered physiology that's eventually reflected in diabetes. And, so if we choose to define diabetes as an elevated blood sugar fasting, then it's not diabetes until we see that. But the physiology has changed before that. The high insulin level, which you can calculate a HOMA score and take your blood sugar and multiply it by the insulin level and divide it by 405, which is a constant. And you can calculate a HOMA score and see that there's a trend towards insulin resistance. The hemoglobin A1C, which reflects the postprandial blood sugar as well as the fasting blood sugar, and see that it's gotten above 5.6. So you're now in the 5.7 to 6.5 ratio, the pre-diabetic ratio. You can see all these trends, and these things are changing as we become obese. It's not obesity causing diabetes, disordered physiology reflected in seeing the physical signs of obesity reflected in eventually having diabetes and having these markers of, elevated blood sugars doing the damage that they do, causing the aging that they do. We talk about hemoglobin A1C, and that's glycated hemoglobin. It means a sugar molecule bound to a hemoglobin. Well, it changed the structure of the hemoglobin. It doesn't carry as much oxygen. It's an aged molecule. It doesn't work as well. Glycation does the same thing to other changes. It changes our skin. It changes our blood vessels. It changes our kidneys. We get changes what goes on in our eyes. We get all the changes what goes on in the nerves in our feet. Like if you do test vibration in people and see that their vibratory sense is decreased, it can be one of the early signs of finding suggestive, not just of some certain nutritional deficiencies, but it can be a sign of early insulin resistance. So this kind of chronic change, and what it brings to mind is that we can look earlier. If we do a deeper dive, and the deepest dive, of course, would be looking at our genomics and looking at our genes, and we're working to figure out those pathways, and we're working to figure out what they mean for us. But the thing we have to remember is that our genes represent an influence that's filtered through our environment. They're not our destiny. Different genes have different effects. One of the genes that causes a role, I think it's 9p21. It refers to a gene on the 9th chromosome in a certain region. There's a gene there that if it has a certain SNP, a certain modification, we've got an increased risk for heart disease. But it's only an increased risk for heart disease if we're eating a diet that's low in fruits and vegetables. It can be reverted. So as we start identifying some of these SNPs, we can start identifying what our risks are and what environment is best for us. And, some very interesting work is being done. The work being done, for example, by Walter Longo with fasting mimicking diets, programs that call forth the best from kind of our metabolisms when we eat diets that represent fasting type patterns, or the intermittent fasting type protocols that are kind of taking advantage of ketosis to reset certain markers. That can play a difference in terms of our aging, in terms of revitalization. And in the right setting and coupled and used correctly, it can be of great help. Similarly, the work that Bredesen has done in terms of looking at the end of Alzheimer's, the recognizing, for example, that what we could call type 3 diabetes, which is insulin resistance within the central nervous system, plays a role in the development of a dementia, and that some of these changes are indeed reversible. So the take home is that if we want to age gracefully, we can work on prevention, and we can work on the distorted physiologies and pull ourselves back. So we've got prevention to keep us from getting there, and the ability to pull ourselves back from the edge that we're approaching, step off of that slope where there are bananas present. There's always an opportunity to make some sort of a difference. We talked about Freeze's and Vida's work. Unfortunately, there was a paper that came out by Crinans in probably the early 2000s, which suggested that we've increased longevity, but we've also increased morbidity. And so it suggests that we haven't achieved the promise of what Freeze and Vida said we could get to. There are ways to make a difference. And so the challenge is for all of us to see what we're going to do for each individual, what you're going to do to get yourself better. We're here at the Functional Medicine Research Center, at the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Center by Metagenics to make a difference. I'm sitting in the same room as I did when it was the Functional Medicine Research Center, so excuse my slip, but we're here to make a difference. We'll be back next month for third Thursday of the month for our 4th lecture. And we have our ongoing series, and at just a few minutes away, we're going to be talking about women's health, and later this afternoon, we're going to be talking about gastrointestinal health, and earlier this morning, we talked about cardiovascular health, and all of those are here on Facebook Live. Thank you for listening and have an awesome day. Take care. Bye-bye.